So next, I'd like to take a look at some options that we have for stitching dialogue together according to various types of custom events in the game. For starters, let's just put these in a folder to clean up a little, and now we can import some new audio files. Open up the Stitching Multiple Dialogue events, and let's just bring all of these sounds into our work unit. Now you'll see that we have three variations of each. We have player 1 and player 2, and we also have progress for generic, negative, and positive. So let's place each of these in respective random containers. Now the idea will be that we are able to stitch together the name of the player alongside a negative or positive progress point, as if that's a single sentence that the announcer is saying in-game. So let's just trigger it so we can hear what that would sound like.
Player 1, kind of having a rough day on the track. Player 2, really off to a good pace here.
So that's what we want the game to be triggering according to the player that is in question and the progress. There's several different ways to do this, and I'm going to start with the simplest and work our way into the more elaborate examples of how this can be done. So for starters, we're going to approach this the same way that we did with the finish sounds. So we'll go into game syncs. In this case, we'll use switches instead of states. And let's create a new switch group for player, which will contain player 1 and player 2 switches. And we can also create a new switch group for status, representative of how well the player is doing. Now, in this case, we have two possible players. Maybe this is a local multiplayer game, and so we can't use states because we are going to have each switch relative to the player in question. So we'll have player, which will be specific to player 1, and again specific to player 2, which is to say they'll each have their own version of this switch set at all times. The same goes for status. So this is when you'd want to use switches instead of states. So we'll go back to events, and let's create a new dialogue event. We'll call it player, and another one, we'll call it status. And now inside player, we can select our switch group player, select player 1, add path, select player 2, add path, and then of course we will populate this with our player 1 and player 2 random containers. We'll go back to status and we'll do the same thing. We'll select our switch group status, strong, add path, weak, add path, and populate this once again with our progress negative and progress positive random containers. Now these would ultimately be stitched together by the game itself. So the game engine would call the player event and then the status event in turn, and by playing them sequentially, they would be triggered to sound as if it was a single sentence. But of course, as you can imagine, Wise can also internally sequence these events. So let's take a look at that. Go back into default work unit and let's create a player status event that we will have trigger both of these sounds in sequence. So we'll go back over to audio and let's just create a new folder for this. And we'll just grab progress negative, progress positive, and the player names, copy those, and place them inside this new folder. Now we want to be able to use the dialogue system to select between player 1 and player 2 and the negative and positive progress. So let's go back over to events before we go any further and take a look at this player status event. So we can select, as we did before, our switch group for player, because that would be the first word spoken in the sentence. But as you can see, that little arrow we selected to select the switch group, it still exists, and we can actually place a second switch group beside it. So let's put status here now. Now we can create a path for player 1 strong, add path, for player 1 weak, add path, and also for player 2 strong and player 2 weak. So we can actually create a series of custom paths according to a set of different states or switches that are available to us. You can even mix switches and states together if the logic that you are using requires something like this. So now that we have our 4 paths of the 4 possible states in question, let's go back over to audio. Now we can't just populate player 1 strong with player 1 because of course that would not be playing a stitched together sequence of sounds. So this is where we're going to start creating custom containers relevant to each one of these possible paths. So in player status, let's create a sequence container for player 1 strong, another for player 1 weak, and so on until we have a sequence container for each possible path. Now inside player 1 strong, we can copy player 1, paste it in there, copy the positive progress, paste it in there. For player 1 weak, copy player 1 and negative, paste it in there. For player 2 strong, we'll do the same thing again. And for player 2 weak, we can do the same thing again and paste it in there. Let's pop back over to the designer layout so that we can go ahead into our sequence containers, populate them as we see fit. And while we're at it, we may also want to make sure that the sequence container plays properly. Right now, they are set to step, so we're going to want to bring them over to continuous. Let's just give it a listen.
Player 2 kind of having a rough day on the track. Player 2 really off to a good pace here. Player 1 looking in top form today.
So that's pretty good. So let's go back over to our events, select player status, come back over to our dialog layout, and now we can populate each of these custom paths with their relevant sequence containers. Now, when each of these paths is triggered by the game engine, Wise will know what to play to make an appropriate customized sentence for that particular situation in game. So this is two ways that you can stitch types of dialogue together according to various states, but you can also use multiple states to trigger specific sound events. We'll look at that in the next clip.